Orson Welles believed he had Hollywood figured out after Citizen Kane became a critical sensation in 1941. At just 26, the radio and theater prodigy assumed cinema would be his next conquest. But RKO Pictures had other ideas for his follow-up masterpiece. The magnificent Ambersons, adapted from Booth Tarkington's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, was Welles's elegy to a vanishing American aristocracy. He employed the same groundbreaking techniques that made Citizen Kane iconic, crafting a somber reflection on progress and loss. The original cut reportedly ran between 131 and 148 minutes, culminating in a haunting finale. Then Welles made a crucial misstep. He left for Brazil to film It's All True in early 1942. In his absence, RKO executives panicked after test audiences reacted poorly to Ambersons' melancholic tone. Without Welles to defend his vision, the studio cut 43 minutes and reshot the ending, reshaping the film into a more conventional drama. The final version was reduced to 88 minutes. Welles returned to find his film unrecognizable. The altered version flopped at the box office and received lukewarm reviews, though its reputation would grow over time. RKO used the failure to sever ties with Welles, branding him too unpredictable and artistically uncompromising. The original footage was lost in a warehouse fire, erasing what many consider one of cinema's greatest lost works. Welles spent the rest of his career largely exiled from mainstream Hollywood. His dream of creative freedom turned into a cautionary tale about giving directors too much control. On April 7, 1960, Michael Powell's career took a devastating turn. His film Peeping Tom premiered in London, and within weeks, the acclaimed director behind The Red Shoes and Black Narcissus found himself ostracized by the British film industry. The story of a disturbed cameraman who films his victims shocked audiences and critics alike. Reviews were scathing. C.A. Lejeune of The Observer resigned in protest, while others labeled the film vicious and morally repugnant. Powell's reputation made the backlash even more jarring. He wasn't a fringe provocateur, he was a respected figure in British cinema. But the film's unflinching portrayal of voyeurism and psychological trauma struck a nerve. Some argued it held up an uncomfortable mirror to the film industry itself. The commercial failure was swift. Theaters pulled the film and Powell's future projects were shelved. By 1961, he was effectively blacklisted in Britain. He relocated to Australia and later worked in Hollywood on smaller projects, a steep fall from his earlier prominence. Though directors like Martin Scorsese would later champion Peeping Tom as a precursor to modern horror, Powell's career never fully recovered. The film that was ahead of its time ended up ending his time in the spotlight. Charles Laughton was at the very height of his illustrious acting career in 1955 when he made the audacious decision to step behind the camera for the first, and ultimately only time. Renowned for his commanding and often unforgettable performances in films such as The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Mutiny on the Bounty, Laughton took a bold creative leap with The Night of the Hunter, a film that would come to define his legacy in ways he could never have anticipated. The Night of the Hunter told the eerie, unsettling tale of a murderous preacher relentlessly pursuing two vulnerable children across the bleak landscape of Depression-era America. Laughton, drawing inspiration from German Expressionism and infusing it with the brooding sensibilities of Southern Gothic, crafted a surreal, dreamlike atmosphere that was unlike anything American audiences had seen before. Robert Mitchum's chilling portrayal of the villainous preacher, with his tattooed knuckles and sing-song menace, remains one of cinema's most haunting and enduring performances. However, audiences in 1955 were unprepared for Laughton's unconventional vision. Expecting a straightforward thriller, viewers instead encountered a stylized, nightmarish fable that defied easy categorization. Critics at the time dismissed the film as overly artistic, confusing, and even pretentious. The film failed at the box office, and Laughton, deeply wounded by the harsh reception and commercial disappointment, never directed another film. Though he continued to act, the sting of failure lingered, and some say he lost faith in Hollywood's willingness to embrace true innovation. Laughton died in 1962, never knowing that The Night of the Hunter would eventually be recognized as a masterpiece, celebrated by critics and filmmakers alike. The film became a cult classic, its brilliance acknowledged too late for the visionary who brought it to life. Dick Powell believed he had found his next big break with The Conqueror in 1956. The former musical star had successfully transitioned into directing, but this historical epic would become his undoing. The film's most glaring issue was its casting. John Wayne as Genghis Khan. With his unmistakable Western drawl and cowboy demeanor, Wayne's portrayal was widely ridiculed. Critics panned the film as absurd, and audiences laughed at lines like, "I feel this Tartar woman is for me, and my blood says take her." But the real danger lay in the filming location, St. George, Utah, downwind from the Nevada test site. The area had been exposed to nuclear fallout, and radioactive dust reportedly blanketed the set. Cast and crew, including Powell, were exposed to hazardous conditions. The Conqueror was a commercial and critical disaster, costing RKO millions. Powell's reputation collapsed. Once sought after, he found himself shut out of major film projects. He retreated to television, his film career effectively over. Producer Howard Hughes was so embarrassed by the film that he reportedly bought every print to suppress it. Powell died of lymphoma 7 years later, fueling speculation about the radiation exposure's role in his illness. The Conqueror became infamous, not just for its miscasting, but for the tragic consequences that followed. In 1933, Stephen Roberts released The Story of Temple Drake, a daring adaptation of William Faulkner's incendiary novel Sanctuary. The film's unflinching portrayal of violence, sexual assault, and moral decay shocked Depression-era audiences and ignited a firestorm of criticism across the country. Roberts, a promising director with a growing reputation for his deft handling of both comedy and drama, suddenly found himself thrust into the national spotlight. Not for his artistry, but for the controversy swirling around his latest work. Religious organizations, civic leaders, and censorship boards swiftly condemned the film, decrying its explicit content and perceived threat to public morals. Several states banned the film outright, and theaters in major cities faced picket lines and boycotts. The uproar over The Story of Temple Drake became a rallying point for those demanding stricter oversight of Hollywood, and the scandal played a significant role in the tightening of the motion picture production code. This new era of censorship would soon reshape the boundaries of what could be shown on American screens, curbing the creative freedoms that had defined pre-code cinema. Despite the controversy, the film initially drew large crowds, curious to see the picture that had scandalized the nation, yet the backlash left a lasting mark on Roberts' career. Studios, wary of attracting similar negative attention, grew hesitant to entrust him with major projects. Although he continued to work in the industry, the shadow of Temple Drake loomed over his subsequent efforts, limiting his opportunities and stifling his once bright prospects. Tragically, Stephen Roberts died of a heart attack in 1936 at just 40 years old. Though he was never officially blacklisted, his career was cut short before he could fully recover from the scandal. Today, his legacy remains inextricably linked to a film that, for better or worse, helped usher in a new era of censorship in American cinema. John Cromwell's Hollywood reign came to an abrupt end in 1958 with The Goddess, a film that should have crowned his distinguished career. The psychological drama starred Kim Stanley as Rita Shawn, a tragic starlet whose meteoric rise becomes a devastating fall, a character inspired by Marilyn Monroe and other troubled actresses of the era. Cromwell, the veteran director behind classics like Of Human Bondage and The Prisoner of Zenda, crafted an unflinching portrait of fame's emotional toll. Stanley delivered a searing performance that earned critical acclaim, with reviewers lauding her raw depiction of vulnerability and unraveling identity. The film dissected Hollywood's star-making machinery with chilling clarity, exposing the industry's more exploitative tendencies. Despite glowing reviews, audiences recoiled from the film's stark honesty. Mainstream viewers avoided it, and Columbia Pictures watched their investment collapse as ticket sales dwindled. The commercial failure proved disastrous for Cromwell, whose career had already been weakened by blacklisting during the early 1950s. Studio executives, wary of Cromwell's political history, reportedly used the film's poor performance as a final excuse to cut ties. The combination of his blacklist past and The Goddess's box office disappointment created an insurmountable obstacle to future studio work. Cromwell was effectively pushed out of major studio filmmaking, turning instead to television and stage directing. Though The Goddess would later be recognized for its psychological depth, in 1958 it marked the end of Cromwell's Hollywood legacy. In 1948, Joseph Losey made his Hollywood debut with The Boy with Green Hair, a fantasy drama about a war orphan whose hair mysteriously turns green. The film's pacifist message was subtle but powerful, urging compassion in a post-war world. At the time, the film wasn't especially controversial. Reviews were mixed, with some praising its message and others finding it overly sentimental. But as Cold War tensions escalated, the film's anti-war stance took on new meaning. By 1951, Losey was targeted by the House Un-American Activities Committee. Though his political affiliations were the main focus, some believe his earlier film made him an easy target. He refused to cooperate with the committee, and the blacklist descended swiftly. Studios severed ties, and Losey left the United States in 1952. He rebuilt his career in Europe, eventually directing acclaimed films like The Servant and The Go-Between, but Hollywood never welcomed him back. The Boy with Green Hair didn't directly end Losey's career, but it became part of the narrative that led to his exile. A film meant to promote peace became a symbol of political suspicion in an era of fear. Irwin Allen's 1957 epic, The Story of Mankind, was conceived as a grand, star-studded morality tale that would both entertain and enlighten. Instead, it became a cautionary example of how not to blend spectacle with substance. Allen, who would later achieve fame as the master of disaster for his blockbuster catastrophe films, assembled an eclectic and impressive cast for this ambitious project. The lineup included Vincent Price, Ronald Colman, and the legendary Marx Brothers, making their final on-screen appearance together a bittersweet milestone in film history. The film's premise was nothing if not bold. A celestial tribunal, presided over by ethereal judges, debates the fate of humanity itself. To make their case, the tribunal presents a series of historical vignettes, each intended to illustrate the triumphs and follies of mankind. However, the execution left much to be desired. The vignettes felt awkwardly disjointed, lacking any real narrative cohesion, and the film's tone swung wildly from solemn philosophical musings to moments of outright absurdity. The intended message, a meditation on humanity's worthiness, was muddled and ultimately lost amid the chaos and spectacle. Critics were merciless, panning the film as incoherent, preachy, and overblown. Audiences, equally unimpressed, stayed away in droves, and the film's commercial failure was swift and decisive. The debacle effectively derailed Allen's early ambitions as a director, though he would later reinvent himself as a wildly successful producer of disaster epics like The Towering Inferno and The Poseidon Adventure. His directorial career never recovered from the implosion of The Story of Mankind. The film remains a curious footnote in Hollywood history, a testament to the perils of excess without focus. Joseph von Sternberg's The Shanghai Gesture, released in 1941, was a daring and stylized noir that defiantly pushed the boundaries of what Hollywood was willing to allow at the time. Adapted from a controversial stage play, the film delved into themes of addiction, colonialism, and moral decay, all cloaked in lush, exoticized visuals and laden with heavy symbolism. Von Sternberg, once celebrated as a visionary auteur for his iconic collaborations with Marlene Dietrich, saw this project as an opportunity to reclaim his place among Hollywood's elite directors. However, the Production Code Administration, already wary of von Sternberg's provocative and often subversive style, intervened forcefully. The original play's brothel setting was sanitized into a gambling house, stripping the story of much of its raw edge and underlying menace. Character motivations, once clear and compelling, were muddled and softened to appease the censors, resulting in a narrative that often felt incoherent and diluted. Despite retaining flashes of von Sternberg's signature visual flair, opulent set designs, dramatic lighting, and a dreamlike atmosphere, the film struggled to connect with critics and audiences alike. Many found it confusing, overly stylized, and emotionally distant. The lackluster reception, combined with von Sternberg's growing reputation for being difficult and uncompromising on set, led studios to distance themselves from the once revered director. Although he would go on to direct a handful of additional films, The Shanghai Gesture marked the beginning of his decline in Hollywood. The film stands as a testament to both his artistic ambition and the stifling constraints of the era's censorship, a turning point after which his influence would steadily wane. Robert Siodmak, a master of film noir, saw his Hollywood career falter with The Great Sinner in 1949. The film, starring Gregory Peck and Ava Gardner, was a lavish adaptation of Dostoevsky's The Gambler. MGM spared no expense, hoping for a prestige hit, but the film's ponderous pacing and melodramatic tone failed to connect. Critics found it overwrought, and audiences were unmoved by its moralizing message. Siodmak, known for taut thrillers like The Killers, seemed out of his element in this literary adaptation. The film's failure signaled a turning point. Siodmak, once in high demand, found fewer opportunities in Hollywood. He returned to Europe, where he continued directing, but his days as a major studio filmmaker in the US were effectively over. Victor Savile's The Silver Chalice from 1954 is remembered less for its biblical story than for nearly derailing Paul Newman's career before it began. The film, a lavish Technicolor epic, was meant to ride the wave of religious blockbusters like The Robe. Instead, it became a cautionary tale. Newman, in his first major film role, later called it the worst movie ever made. Critics agreed. The film's stilted dialogue, awkward sets, and lifeless direction made it a laughingstock. Savile, once a respected director of British and American films, bore the brunt of the blame. The Silver Chalice's failure marked the end of Savile's Hollywood career. Though he continued producing, he never directed another major film. Newman fortunately rebounded quickly, but Victor Savile's reputation never recovered. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.